Time. Leisure time. Did you ever stop to think how much leisure time you really have? Some of us put our leisure time to good use. And some of us, Ken Michaels, for example, spend most of our leisure time just moping.
Moping? He thinks I'm moping. Well, who wouldn't mope? There's nothing to do. Nobody's around. You know how it is. I went down to the bowling alley. Went over to the drugstore. None of the gang was there. All my friends are busy, so what's for me to do?
Do you suppose Ken has more leisure time than his friends do?
Huh? Well, no, I don't have more time. We all spend about the same amount of time in school, and the rest is leisure time. I've got nothing to do but wait for supper. My friends have more things to do. They're lucky.
Ken's pretty lucky, too.
Listen to that. All right, I'll bite. Why am I lucky?
Because you have so much leisure time. Time in which you can do things you enjoy. Time in which you don't have to work.
Like this, huh? Is that good?
Let me show you a few things. Suppose you had lived 100 years ago. What would you have been like? Take a look.
Where? Oh, is that me? Is that what I would have looked like 100 years ago?
Well, perhaps. But now, well, let's look back 100 years again and see someone else.
Who? Hey, that's my dad.
Young man, you get off that bed and get to work. After you clean out the stable, you can build some new steps for the back porch. While I work 72 hours a week, no son of mine is going to loaf.
72 hours?
12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Tomorrow morning, young man, you're going out to get a regular job. You can work too, and earn your keep.
Not so good, Ken? Well, let's try another picture. Say about 50 years ago.
Oh, hello, son. Well, say, I've got some new pictures for the stereoscope. We'll look at them tonight. Don't forget about your chores. Have them all done by the time I'm through work. And keep the wood box full.
Boy, how long will you work, Dad?
Why, 10 hours. 10 hours a day, every day except Sunday.
60 hours a week? Boy.
Well, Ken, let's take a look at your father's time as it really is today.
Hi, Dad. You sure don't work as long hours as they used to.
That's right, Ken. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do so much work in so little time. This 40-hour week suits me fine. And some people even work shorter hours nowadays. But by the way, Ken, how'd you like to play a quick round of golf before supper? I think we can work it in. And then later I'd like to shellac that new bookcase I'm making.
Well, Ken?
Yes, Dad does enjoy his leisure time. And to think that a few years ago, people didn't have nearly so much time to themselves.
Yes, we've gained a lot of leisure time in the last century or so. All of us.
Wait a minute. All of us? Mother should hear you say that. She's always complaining that she doesn't have enough time.
Well, let's see about that. Can you picture your mother as she might have been 50 years ago?
I guess so.
My, that's hard work. It takes so much time, too. But that's woman's lot in life. Scrub clothes, carry water, bake bread, feed the chickens, till time to go to bed and then get up again to start all over again.
You see, Ken? Now, how about today?
My, this new washer certainly is a time saver. And I do need some extra time. Now, let's see, I want to do some shopping, but this first.
Wait a minute. This may be easier work, but it still looks like work.
Oh, well, I have to plan the program for the Women's Club next month. That's one of my favorite activities, you know. It does keep me busy, but, well, that's not work.
What do you think, Ken?
Well, Mother does have more leisure time now. But still, she's always busy. How does she find so many things to do? How can I find something to do with my extra time? Or for that matter, what about you? I don't know. It seems as if leisure time is a problem.
Well, let's see how your friends have met that problem.
I told him once my friends were all busy. Oh, busy. They have something to do with their time. Let's see. Last I saw of Dave, he was headed that-a-way.
You mean this way? Yes. Dave has a hobby of identifying birds. It's a pleasant way of spending his time, and besides, it helps him with some of his schoolwork. You can learn quite a bit from hobbies. Here's Bill. Some of his leisure time is spent doing part-time work at the bookstore. Along with earning some spending money, he's getting experience that will help him later on. And Alice is devoting some of her leisure to learning to sew. That's something she'll be glad she did when she's older. And right now, she gets a big kick out of it. Here's the way Marge spends some of her leisure time. She's learning to play the piano. She's getting a lot of pleasure from her own accomplishment. And she's acquiring a skill that will help her socially. And some of the fellows spend their time in group activities that are building them up physically, as well as providing them with a lot of fun.
So that's what they're all doing. No wonder I couldn't find them. I'll bet you think I should figure out something to do with my time. The question is, how will I know it's the right kind of thing? How will I know I'm using my time well?
Your father mentioned a bookcase he was making, didn't he? Remember how he worked at it last night? Mr. Michaels, you gain 3 important things from your hobby, don't you?
Do I? All I know is this is a pleasant change from my work, and I'm learning a few things. Someday, when I get more time, I'm going to make new furniture for the whole house.
Well, there you are. Do you see now, Ken?
I think so. A good use of leisure time should give you a change. It should help you learn things, and, well, now I'm not sure about the third.
It's a good idea to have a long-range goal for your leisure time activities. But it isn't always easy to find a single occupation that will give you all 3 values.
Then you should have more than one activity?
It does help. Of course, even one thing to do is better than just moping. For instance, swimming is a pleasant change, a lot of fun.
Hello. It's been not that long since the last live stream, but the passage of time has definitely been felt as the turbulences of the library grow stronger. So, first and foremost, I want to say sorry if, you know, the energy's a little low. That's kind of just what it is. I'm working on it, I think. Sorry for it being a weird time. That's the other thing. I scheduled it to it should have been scheduled for 6-7 hours ago. That has not happened. Instead, we're here now. Although I'm a little tired. Oh, the music might be a little loud. Okay. But yeah, other than that, this is the stream now, and we're here. We're here to read. Oh yeah, also just if there's any like, yes, I'm aware that when you the phrases the phrase discipline and punish, or perhaps when you the thoughts associated with discipline, maybe less discipline and more punishment, tends to, because of the effect of the internet normalizing, arguably over normalizing what is or at least what used to be taboo, and kind of as a side effect of this sort of liberation experienced, there is a strong inclination for those who are young, probably, or people who spent a lot of their recent time on the internet, to associate the word punishment with something related to that of a kink, or like, you know, something sexual. That has nothing to do with Foucault, yeah, at all. So make the jokes now if you want, but you're going to be very disappointed, because there's going to be nothing arousing about imprisonment. Yeah, Coffee has raised the example. I'm sure I don't have to, but that's what that is. I'm aware, I understand, and if it helps to get out of your system, you can do so at your leisure, but that's just not what this stream's gonna be about. Not even with the fingers and the emoji Odara, no. Do you plan to meet the immediate start? It's a little graphic. I haven't actually read this before. I have no experience. I've never read Foucault. And this is a good... And I think playing Papers, Please on Friday is a good reason to. So that's what I'm reading now. But I have not actually read the start at all. I don't mind it being graphic. I think it'd be dishonest to like skip whatever is graphic, because I'm sure there was a reason why it's graphic. And I'm not... You can probably tell from the other reading streams I've done, I'm not keen on unnecessary censorship. And I think in this regard, it's unnecessary, or at least you lose more than you gain from censoring maybe perhaps certain things that are graphic, but it depends, right? Well, I haven't actually read this book yet, so we'll see. I haven't read anything from Foucault either, so I'm rather ill-informed. Not very well read on him or about him, really. Hello, Crank. Welcome everyone to the stream. Okay. I don't know much. I don't know anything actually about Foucault. He was just a thinker that was widely influential in his time, and one of the ideas that he talked about was, or perhaps was, his deconstruction of certain ideas like madness, like a history of what that is and how that's treated in philosophy, and as well as, like, you know, the criminalization and punishment comes with this. I don't really know anything at all more than that, and if I were to you know, try to force an introduction, I would just end up regurgitating a Wikipedia page. And I think that is an amount of time that does not need to be spent, because what better way to introduce him than to read him, right? He's big on power as a concept. Yes. That's what I read about as well. And he was particularly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. I knew that. Yes. So he was kind of big on seeing the way power structures developed. Yep. And he's kind of based, from what I know. He spent a lot of time arguing for left-wing politics, I think. He argued a lot for like anti-racism, anti-homophobia. His death he died because of HIV, and so his husband Daniel spent like the remainder of his time, I think, like raising awareness for that. I think that's all the lore I know of prior to this reading. And so without further ado, I suppose, we may begin reading Michel Foucault. Yeah. If anyone has any questions while we read, just leave them in the chat and I'll read through them. I cannot promise at all a good answer to them, but I can promise to read them and think about them alongside you. That's all I can do. History of Sexuality is a really good one. Right, yes, he did that as well. Of course. Anyways, alright. Michel Foucault. Discipline and Punish. The Birth of the Prison. Here this little view. Foucault's genius is called forth into the eloquent clarity of his passions, his best book. It's from the Washington Post. Bit of a biography here. Born in France, 1926. He lectured, yep. He was director of Germany, yep. And he wrote a lot for newspapers and reviews. Cool. He held a prestigious chair too. Great. Sure. This is the version translated from the French by Alan Sheridan. There's a link to it in the description if anyone wants to read along or read ahead or continue reading, because I'm not going to read all like 300 pages of this. I'm probably going to cover, I guess, just part 1. Yeah, I'll probably just cover part 1. Well, maybe part 1, the first part of part 1. Alongside the translator's note. Maybe. We'll see. List of plates. Okay, yep, there's a list of plates here. And here's a translator's note. Any closer translation of the French title of this book? Surveiller et punir. Hold on.
Surveiller et punir.
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 Surveiller et punir. 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 They don't roll their R's. It's a little difficult for me. I'm sorry. This is the best I can do. Any closer translation of the French title of this book, Surveiller et punir, has proven unsatisfactory on various counts. To begin with, Foucault uses the infinitive, which, as here, may have the effect of an impersonal imperative. Such a nuance is denied us in English. More seriously, the verb surveiller has no adequate English equivalent. Our noun surveillance has an altogether too restricted and technical use. Jeremy Bentham used the term inspect, which Foucault translates as surveiller, but the range of connotations does not correspond. Supervise is perhaps closest of all, but again the word has different associations. observe as rather too neutral, though Foucault is aware of the aggression involved in any one-sided observation. In the end, Foucault himself suggested discipline and punish, which relates closely to the book's structure. Another problem was posed by the French word supplice, I think it's supplice, which heads the first part of the book. For the sake of brevity, I have entitled this first part Torture, but no single English word will cover the full range of the French. Here, supplice refers specifically to the public torture, an execution of criminals that provided one of the most popular spectacles of 18th century France. By extension, the word can also refer to any prolonged torture, mental as well as physical. Depending on the context, I've translated the word by torture, public execution, or scaffold. The author also refers to another form of torture, la question. Is that right? I don't know what that's like in French, never mind. The extraction of confessions by interrogation and the systematic application of pain. Here I have followed the accepted translation, judicial torture. References to other works are usually given not in footnotes, but in an abbreviated form in the text itself. These references in brackets consisted of the author's name and a page number. Dates of publication are used to distinguish more than one work by an author, and Roman numerals refer to volume numbers. Full references are to be found in the bibliography. Okay, that makes sense. Also always bear in mind that translations are translations, right? But I'm sure I don't have to stress that by now. Any questions so far? Welcome to the stream, Cody. Tara just noticed librarian streaming. It's only been 20 minutes. He's already reading Turbulences in Space-Time, indeed. Yes. Sometimes stuff for real. Myself won't even start tilted after the start of the live. Well, let's hope that fixes itself and sorts itself out. And if not, there'll be a VOD. Alright, let's begin. Part 1. Torture. The body of the condemned. And I've been warned that this might be a little violent, physically, but, well, if you're clicking onto a stream with the book in title, surely you would have, expected it. But if not, again, just a warning. Perhaps don't listen to this while you're having food. But the brutality and the graphic, and how graphic it is not unnecessary, right? So, the body of the condemned. On 2nd of March, 1757, Damiens the regicide was condemned to make the amende honorable before the main door of the Church of Paris, where he was to be taken and conveyed in a cart, wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax weighing 2 pounds, then in the said cart, to the place de grave, where, on a scaffold that will be erected there, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers, his right hand holding the knife with which he committed the said parricide, burnt with sulphur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away, poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax, and sulphur melted together. And then his body drawn and quartered by 4 horses, and his limbs and body consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the winds. Finally, he was quartered, recounts the Gazette d'Amsterdam, 1st of April. This last operation was very long, because the horses used were not accustomed to drawing. Consequently, instead of 4, 6 were needed, and when that did not suffice, they were forced, in order to cut off the wretch's thighs, to sever the sinews, and hack at the joints. It is said that though he was always a great swearer, no blasphemy escaped his lips. The excessive pain made him utter horrible cries, and he often repeated, "My God, have pity on me. Jesus, help me." Spectators were all edified by the solicitude of the parish priest of St. Paul's, who, despite his great age, did not spare himself in offering consolation to the patient. Bouton, an officer of the watch, left us his account. The sulphur was lit, but the flame was so poor that only the top skin of the hand was burnt, and that only slightly. Then the executioner, his sleeves rolled up, took the steel pincers which had been especially made for the occasion, and which were about 1.5 feet long, and pulled first at the calf of the right leg, then at the thigh, and from there at the 2 fleshy parts of the right arm, then at the breasts. Though a strong, sturdy fellow, this executioner found it so difficult to tear away the pieces of flesh that he set about the same spot 2 or 3 times, twisting the pincers as he did so, and what he took away formed at each part a wound about the size of a 6-pound crown piece. After these tearings with the pincers, Damien, who cried out profusely, though without swearing, raised his head and looked at himself. The same executioner dipped an iron spoon in the pot containing the boiling potion, which he poured liberally over each wound. Then the ropes that were to be harnessed to the horses were attached with cords to the patient's body. The horses were then harnessed and placed alongside the arms and legs, one at each limb. Monsieur Le Breton, clerk of the court, went up to the patient several times and asked him if he had anything to say. He said he had not. At each torment he cried out, as the damned in hell are supposed to cry out, "Pardon, my God, pardon, Lord." Despite all this pain, he raised his head from time to time and looked at himself boldly. The cords had been tied so tightly by the men who pulled the ends that they caused him indescribable pain. Monsieur Le Breton went up to him again and asked him if he had anything to say. He said no. Several confessors went up to him and spoke to him at length. He willingly kissed the crucifix that was held out to him. He opened his lips and repeated, "Pardon, Lord." The horses tugged hard, each pulling straight on a limb, each horse held by an executioner. After a quarter of an hour, the same ceremony was repeated, and finally, after several attempts, the direction of the horses had to be changed. Thus, those at the arms were made to pull toward the head, those at the thighs towards the arms, which broke the arms at the joints. This was repeated several times without success. He raised his head and looked at himself. 2 more horses had to be added to those harnessed to the thighs, which made 6 horses in all, without success. Finally, the executioner Samson said to Monsieur Le Breton there was no way of, or hope, of succeeding, and told him to ask their lordships if they wished to have the prisoner cut into pieces. Monsieur Le Breton, who had come down from the town, ordered that renewed efforts be made, and this was done. But the horses gave up, and one of those harnessed to the thighs fell to the ground. The confessors returned and spoke to him again. He said to them, I heard him, "Kiss me, gentlemen." The parish priest of St. Paul's did not dare to, so Monsieur de Marchilly slipped under the rope, holding the left arm, and kissed him on the forehead. The executioners gathered round, and Damiens told them not to swear, to carry out their task, and that he did not think ill of them. He begged them to pray to God for him, and asked the parish priest of St. Paul's to pray for him at the first Mass. After 2 or 3 attempts, the executioner Samson, and he who had used the pincers, each drew out a knife from his pocket, and cut the body at the thighs instead of severing the legs at the joints. The 4 horses gave a tug and carried off the 2 thighs after them, namely, that of the right side first, the other following, and the same was done to the arms, the shoulders, the armpits, and the 4 limbs. The flesh had to be cut, almost to the bone. The horses, pulling hard, carried off the right arm first and the other afterwards. When the 4 limbs had been pulled away, the confessors came to speak to him, but his executioner told them that he was dead. Though the truth was that I saw the man move, his lower jaw moving from side to side as if he were talking. One of the executioners even said shortly afterwards that when they had lifted the trunk to throw it on the stake, he was still alive. The 4 limbs were untied from the ropes and thrown on the stake set up in the enclosure, in line with the scaffold. Then the trunk and the rest were covered with logs and faggots, and fire was put to the straw mixed with this wood. In accordance with the decree, the whole was reduced to ashes. The last piece to be found in the embers was still burning at 10:30 in the evening. The pieces of flesh and the trunk had taken about 4 hours to burn, the officers of whom I was one, as also was my son, and a detachment of archers remained in the square until nearly 11 o'clock. There were those who made something of the fact that a dog had lain the day before on the grass where the fire had been chased away several times, and had always returned. But it is not difficult to understand that an animal found this place warmer than elsewhere. Okay. So, just very quickly, I know what you might be thinking, because that's what I was thinking. I thought a little bit as well. This is a little excessive, isn't it? In such really painful detail. But of course I think that's the point. And I understand if you're discomforted by it. I think the intent was to discomfort you. But I hope that me reading this alongside you has made it less discomforting in that way and has helped you stomach through it. Because beneath this discomfort lies something very important. I might venture to say. Any questions so far? I know that bit was quite difficult, just wanted to see. No idea what this is about. Is it actually a sex thing or is it a torture thing? The latter. I hope that's been made clear. It probably has by now. Oh, it's a torture thing. Yeah. I think it's less of fun S&M stuff and more like horrible treatment of prisoners. Yeah. Why are we getting this reading? Is this your version of self-flagellation? No, it's more just I was thinking about an appropriate reading for Papers, Please, and this came to mind first, both as something that I think is relevant and also something I have yet to read, and it would be a good excuse to read, right? So, yeah, that's the main reason. Literally none of this is in line with the Geneva Convention. Well, there's a reason why we created that, right? Maybe don't listen to this when you're about to eat. Yeah, sorry. Feels like the hammer of mooches. Okay. This is the context for building some thesis about punishment, you assume, but since you came here, it's only been a story about someone getting ripped apart. I'm kind of lost. Yeah, that's probably what this is. Yeah. Only popping in briefly, but love the streams. Thanks for the streams. Thank you for popping in. I'm happy that you're happy with these. People nowadays are so distant from capital punishment that such depictions are more cartoonish and horrifying. Yeah. I mean, definitely. This is almost like fiction, right? There's almost a part of it where if it weren't for the fact that it's documented history, you'd be like, well, this is so absurdly like outlandish. There's no way this is how we punish people, but well, there you go, right? The truth is often stranger than fiction, that's for sure. Of course, in part because it's true. Alright, but it seems like everyone's kind of warming up to it or leaving it at their own pace. Absolutely fine. And in that case, we can continue. 80 years later, Léon Faucher drew up his rules for the house of young prisoners in Paris. The prisoners' day will begin at 6 in the morning in winter and 5 in summer. They will work for 9 hours a day throughout the year. 2 hours a day will be devoted to instruction. Work end of the day will end at 9 o'clock in winter and at 8 in summer. Rising. At the first drum roll, the prisoners must rise and dress in silence as the supervisor opens the cell doors. At the second drum roll, they must be dressed and make their beds. At the third, they must line up and proceed to the chapel for morning prayer. There's a 5-minute interval between each drum roll. Prayers are conducted by the chaplain and followed by a moral or religious reading. This exercise must not last more than half an hour. Work. At 5:45 in the summer, 5:45 in winter, the prisoners go down into the courtyard where they must wash their... where they must wash their hands and face and receive their first ration of bread. Immediately afterwards, they form into work teams and go off to work, which must begin at 6 in summer and 7 in winter. Meal. At 10 o'clock, the prisoners leave their work and go to the refectory. They wash their hands in the courtyards and assemble in divisions. After the dinner, there is recreation until 20 minutes to 11. School. At 20 minutes to 11, at the drum roll, the prisoners form into ranks and proceed in divisions to the school. The class lasts 2 hours and consists alternately of reading, writing, drawing, and arithmetic. At 20 minutes to 1, the prisoners leave the school in divisions and return to their courtyards for recreation. At 5 minutes to 1, the drum roll, they form into work teams. At 1 o'clock, they must be back in the workshops. They work until 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, the prisoners leave their workshops and go into the courtyards where they wash their hands and form into divisions for the refectory. Supper and the recreation that follows it lasts until 5 o'clock. The prisoners then return to the workshops. At 7 o'clock in the summer, at 8 in winter, work stops. Bread is distributed for the last time in the workshops. For a quarter of an hour, one of the prisoners or supervisors reads a passage from some instructive or uplifting work. This is followed by an evening prayer. At 7:30 in summer and 8:30 in winter, the prisoners must be back in their cells after the washing of hands and the inspection of clothes in the courtyard. At the first drum roll, they must undress, and at the second, get into bed. The cell doors are closed, and the supervisors go the rounds in the corridors to ensure order and silence. We have then a public execution and a timetable. They do not punish the same crimes or the same type of delinquent, but they each define a certain penal style. Less than a century separates them. It was a time when, in Europe and in the United States, the entire economy of punishment was redistributed. It was a time of great scandals for traditional justice, a time of innumerable projects for reform. It saw a new theory of law and crime, a new moral or political justification for the right to punish. Old laws were abolished, old customs died out. Modern codes were planned or drawn up. Russia 1769, Prussia 1780, Pennsylvania and Tuscany 1786, Austria 1788, France 1791, year 4, 1808, and 1810. It was a new age for penal justice. Amongst the many changes, I shall consider one: the disappearance of torture as public spectacle. Today we are rather inclined to ignore it. Perhaps in its time it gave rise to too much inflated rhetoric. Perhaps it has been attributed too readily and too empathetically to a process of humanization, thus dispensing with the need for further analysis. And in any case, how important is such a change when compared with the great institutional transformations, the formulation of explicit general codes and unified rules of procedure with the almost universal adoption of the jury system, the definition of the essentially corrective character of the penalty and the tendency, which has become increasingly marked since the 19th century, to adapt punishment to the individual offender. Punishment of a less immediately physical kind, a certain discretion in the art of inflicting pain, a combination of more subtle, more subdued sufferings, deprived of their visible display, should not all this be treated as a special case, an incidental effect of deeper changes. And yet the fact remains that a few decades saw the disappearance of the tortured, dismembered, amputated body, symbolically branded on face or shoulder, exposed alive or dead to the public view. The body, as the major target of penal repression, disappeared. By the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, the gloomy festival of punishment was dying out, though here and there it flickered momentarily into life. In this transformation, two processes were at work. They did not have quite the same chronology or the same raison d'etre. Raison d'etre, I think? The first was the disappearance of punishment as a spectacle. The ceremonial of punishment tended to decline. It survived only as a new legal or administrative practice. The amende honorable was first abolished in France in 1791. Then again in 1830 after a brief revival. The pillory was abolished in France in 1789 and in England in 1837. The use of prisoners in public works, cleaning city streets or repairing the highways, was practiced in Austria, Switzerland, and certain of the United States, such as Pennsylvania. These convicts, distinguished by their infamous dress and shaven heads, were brought before the public. The sport of the idle and the vicious, they often become incensed and naturally took violent revenge upon the aggressors. To prevent them from returning injuries which might be inflicted upon them, they were encumbered with iron collars and chains, to which bombshells were attached, to be dragged along while they performed their degrading service under the eyes of keepers armed with swords, blunderbusses, and other weapons of destruction. This practice was abolished practically everywhere at the end of the 18th or the beginning of the 19th century. The public exhibition of prisoners was maintained in France in 1831, despite violent criticism. A disgusting scene, said Réal. It was finally abolished in April 1848. While the chain gang, which had dragged convicts across the whole of France as far as Brest and Toulon, was replaced in 1837 by inconspicuous black-painted cell carts, punishment had gradually ceased to be a spectacle. And whatever theatrical elements it still retained were now downgraded, as if the functions of the penal ceremony were gradually ceasing to be understood, as if this rite that concluded the crime was suspected of being in some undesirable way linked to it. It was as if the punishment was thought to be equal, if not to exceed, in savagery the crime itself, to accustom the spectators to a ferocity from which one wished to divert them, to show them the frequency of crime, to make the executioner resemble a criminal, judges murderers, to reverse roles at the last moment, to make the tortured criminal an object of pity or admiration. As early as 1764, Beccaria remarked, "The murder that is depicted as a horrible crime is repeated in cold blood, remorselessly. The public execution is now seen as a hearth in which violence bursts again into flame." Punishment, then, will tend to become the most hidden part of the penal process. This has several consequences. It leaves the domain of more or less everyday perception and enters that of abstract consciousness. Its effectiveness is seen as resulting from its inevitability, not from its visible intensity. It is the certainty of being punished, and not the horrifying spectacle of public punishment that must discourage crime. The exemplary mechanics of punishment changes its mechanisms. As a result, justice no longer takes public responsibility for the violence that is bound up with its practice. If it too strikes, if it too kills, it is not as a glorification of its strength, but as an element of itself that it is obliged to tolerate, that it finds difficult to account for. The apportioning of blame is redistributed, its punishment a spectacle, a confused horror spread from the scaffold. It enveloped both executioner and condemned, and although it was always ready to invert the shame inflicted on the victim into pity or glory, it often turned the legal violence of the executioner into shame. Now, the scandal and the light are to be distributed differently. It is the conviction itself that marks the offender with the unequivocally negative sign. The publicity has shifted to the trial and to the sentence. The execution itself is like an additional shame that justice is ashamed to impose on the condemned man. So it keeps its distance from the act, tending always to entrust it to others, under the seal of secrecy. It is ugly to be punishable, but there is no glory in punishing. Hence the double system of protection that justice has set up between itself and the punishment it imposes. Those who carry out the penalty tend to become an autonomous sector. Justice is relieved from responsibility for it by a bureaucratic concealment of the penalty itself. It is typical that in France the administration of the prison should, for so long, have been the responsibility of the Ministry of the Interior, while responsibility for the bagness, for penal servitude in the convict ships and penal settlements, lay with the Ministry of the Navy or the Ministry of the Colonies. And beyond this distribution of roles operates a theoretical disavowal. Do not imagine that the sentences that we judges pass are activated by a desire to punish. They are intended to correct, reclaim, cure. A technique of improvement represses, in the penalty, the strict expiation of evildoing, and relieves the magistrates of the demeaning task of punishing. In modern justice and on the part of those who dispense it, there is a shame in punishing, which does not always preclude zeal. This sense of shame is constantly growing. The psychologists and the minor civil servants of moral orthopedics proliferate on the wound it leaves. The disappearance of public executions marks therefore the decline of the spectacle, but it also marks a slackening of the hold on the body. In 1787, in an address to the Society for Promoting Political Inquiries, Benjamin Rush remarked, "I can only hope that the time is not far away when gallows, pillory, scaffold, flogging, and wheel will, in the history of punishment, be regarded as the marks of barbarity of centuries and of countries, and as proofs of the feeble influence of reason and religion over the human mind." Indeed, 60 years later, Van Menen, opening the Second Penitentiary Congress in Brussels, recalled the time of his childhood as of a past age. "I have seen the ground strewn with wheels, gibbets, gallows, pillories. I have seen hideously stretched skeletons on wheels." Branding had been abolished in England and in France. In 1820, England no longer dared to apply the full punishment reserved for traitors. Thistlewood was not quartered. Only flogging still remained in a number of penal systems, Russia, England, and Prussia. But generally speaking, punitive practices had become more reticent. One no longer touched the body, or at least as little as possible, and then only to reach something other than the body itself. It might be objected that imprisonment, confinement, forced labor, penal servitude, prohibition from entering certain areas, deportation, which have occupied so important a place in modern penal systems, are physical penalties. Unlike fines, for example, they directly affect the body. But the punishment-body relation is not the same as it was in the torture during public executions. The body now serves as an instrument or intermediary. If one intervenes upon it to imprison it or to make it work, it is in order to deprive the individual of a liberty that is regarded both as a right and as a property. The body, according to this penalty, is caught up in a system of constraints and privations, obligations and prohibitions. Physical pain, the pain of the body itself, is no longer the constituent element of the penalty. From being an art of unbearable sensations, punishment has become an economy of suspended rights. If it is still necessary for the law to reach and manipulate the body of the convict, it will be at a distance in the proper way according to strict rules and with a much higher aim. As a result of this new restraint, a whole army of technicians took over from the executioner. The immediate anatomists of pain, warders, doctors, chaplains, psychiatrists, psychologists, educationalists, by their very presence near the prisoner, they sing the praises that the law needs. They reassure it that the body and pain are not the ultimate objects of its punitive action. Today, a doctor must watch over those condemned to death, right up to the last moment, thus juxtaposing himself as the agent of welfare, as the alleviator of pain, with the official whose task it is to end life. This is worth thinking about. Indeed it is. When the moment of execution approaches, the patients are injected with tranquilizers. A utopia of judicial reticence. Take away life, but prevent the patient from feeling it. Deprive the prisoner of all rights, but do not inflict pain. Impose penalties free of all pain. Recourse to psychopharmacology and to various physiological disconnectors, even if it is temporary, is a logical consequence of this non-corporal penalty. Ooh, I think that's the juicy bit. He kind of is tying all together now. It's the sequence. I want to read it again. A utopia of judicial reticence. Take away life, but prevent the patient from feeling it. Deprive the prisoner of all rights, but do not inflict pain. Impose penalties free of all pain. Recourse to psychopharmacology and to various physiological disconnectors, even if it is temporary, is a logical consequence of this non-corporal penalty. Interesting. This is worth thinking about. Blob says, really like more or less amoral, or at least in focus, philosophers. In my experience, they're usually very thorough in the description because that's the bulk of what's left. Interesting observation. And I'm inclined to agree. Okay. I thought, yeah, this is a good this point of the reading is where it begins to connect the dots kind of begin to connect for me. But I'm sure further ahead it will be as well. Let's see. The modern rituals of execution attest to this double process: the disappearance of the spectacle and the elimination of pain. The same movement has affected the various European legal systems, each at its own rate. The same death for all, the execution no longer bears the specific mark of the crime or the social status of the criminal. A death that lasts only a moment. No torture must be added to it in advance, no further actions performed upon the corpse. An execution that affects life rather than the body. There are no longer any of those long processes in which death was both retarded by calculated interruptions and multiplied by a series of successive attacks. There are no longer any of those combinations of tortures that were organized for the killing of regicides, or of the kind advocated at the beginning of the 18th century by the anonymous author of Hanging Not Punishment Enough, by which the condemned man would be broken on the wheel and flogged until he fainted, then hung up with chains, and finally left to die slowly of hunger. There are no longer any of those executions in which the condemned man was dragged along on a hurdle to prevent his head smashing against the cobblestones, in which his belly was opened up, his entrails quickly ripped out so that he had time to see them, with his own eyes being thrown on the fire, in which he was finally decapitated, and his body quartered. The reduction of these 1,000 deaths to strict capital punishment defines a whole new morality concerning the act of punishing. As early as 1760, a hanging machine had been tried out in England for the execution of Lord Ferrer. It made use of a support which opened under the feet of the condemned man, thus avoiding slow deaths and the altercations that occurred between victim and executioner. It was improved and finally adopted in 1783, the same year in which the traditional procession from Newgate to Tyburn was abolished, and in which the opportunity offered by the rebuilding of the prison after the Gordon riots was used to set up the scaffolds in Newgate itself. The celebrated Article 3 of the French Code of 1791, "Every man condemned to death will have his head cut off," bears this triple signification: an equal death for all. Crimes of the same kind will be punished by the same kind of punishment, whatever the rank and the state of the guilty man may be. In the words of the motion proposed by Guillotine and passed on 1st December 1789, one death per condemned man obtained by a single blow without recourse to those long and consequently cruel methods of execution, such as the gallows, denounced by Le Belletier. Lastly, punishment for the condemned man alone, since decapitation, the capital punishment of the nobility, was the least shaming for the criminal's family. The guillotine, first used in March 1792, was the perfect vehicle for these principles. Death was reduced to a visible but instantaneous event. Contact between the law, or those who carry it out, and the body of the criminal is reduced to a split second. There's no physical confrontation. Executioner needs be no more than a meticulous watchmaker. Experience and reason demonstrate that the method used in the past to cut off the head of a criminal exposed him to a torture more frightful than the loss of life alone, which is the express intention of the law. The execution should therefore be carried out in a single moment and with a single blow. Examples show how difficult it is to achieve this. For the method to work perfectly, it must necessarily depend on invariable mechanical means whose force and effect may also be determined. It is an easy enough matter to have such an unfailing machine built. Decapitation will be performed in a moment according to the intention of the new law. If this apparatus seems necessary, it will cause no sensation and will be scarcely noticed. The guillotine takes life almost without touching the body, just as prison deprives of liberty or a fine reduces wealth. It is intended to apply the law not so much to a real body capable of feeling pain as to a juridical subject, the possessor, among other rights, of the right to exist. It had to have the abstraction of the law itself. No doubt something of the old public execution was, for a time, superimposed in France on the sobriety of the new method. Parricides and the regicides who were regarded as such were led to the scaffold wearing a black veil. There, until 1832, one of their hands was cut off. Thereafter, nothing remained but the ornamental crib. Thus it was in the case of Féchy that the would-be assassin of Louis Philippe in November 1836. He will be taken to the place of execution wearing a shirt, barefoot, his head covered with a black veil. He will be exhibited upon a scaffold while an usher reads the sentence to the people, and he will be immediately executed. Would you remember Damien's, and note that the last addition to penal death was on a mourning veil. The condemned man was no longer to be seen. Only the reading of the sentence on the scaffold announced the crime, and the crime must be faceless. The more monstrous a criminal was, the more he must be deprived of light. He must not see or be seen. This was a common enough notion at the time. For the parricide, one should construct an iron cage or dig an impenetrable dungeon that would serve him as an eternal retreat. The last vestige of the great public execution was its annulment, a drapery to hide a body. Benoit, triply infamous, his mother's murderer, a homosexual, an assassin, was the first. Well, that's a string of words. Sorry. His mother's murderer, a homosexual, an assassin, was the first of the parricides not to have a hand cut off. As the sentence was being read, he stood on the scaffold supported by the executioners. It was a horrible sight. Wrapped in a large white shroud, his face covered with black crepe, the parricide escaped the gaze of the silent crowd, and beneath these mysterious and gloomy clothes, life was manifested only by frightful cries, which soon expired under the knife. At the beginning of the 19th century, then, the great spectacle of physical punishment disappeared. The tortured body was avoided, the theatrical representation of pain was excluded from punishment. The age of sobriety and punishment had begun. By 1830 to 48, public executions preceded by torture had almost entirely disappeared. Of course, this generalization requires some qualification. To begin with, the changes did not come about at once or as a part of a single process. There were delays. Paradoxically, England was one of the countries most loath to see the disappearance of the public execution, perhaps because of the role of the model that the institution of the jury, public hearings, and respect of habeas corpus had given to her criminal law. Above all, no doubt, because she did not wish to diminish the rigor of her penal laws during the great social disturbances of the years 1780 to 1820. For a long time, Romilly, Mackintosh, and Fowell Buxton failed in their attempts to attenuate the multiplicity and severity of the penalties laid down by English law. That horrible butchery, as Rossi described. Its severity, in fact, the juries regarded the penalties laid down as excessive and were consequently more lenient in their application, had even increased. In 1760, Blackstone had listed 160 capital crimes in English legislation, while by 1819 there were 223. One should also take into account the advances and retreats that the process as a whole underwent between 1760 and 1840. The rapidity of reform in certain countries such as Austria, Russia, the United States, France under the Constituent Assembly, then the retreat at the time of the counter-revolutions in Europe and the great social fear of the years 1820 to 48, more or less temporary changes introduced by the emergency courts or laws. The gaps between the laws and the real practice of the courts, which was by no means a faithful reflection of the state of legislation, all these factors account for the irregularity of the transformation that occurred at the turn of the century. It should be added that, although most of the changes had been achieved by 1840, although the mechanisms of punishment had by then assumed their new way of functioning, the process was far from complete. The reduction in the use of torture was a tendency that was rooted in the great transformation of the years 1760 to 1840. But it did not end there. It can be said that the practice of the public execution haunted our penal system for a long time, and still haunts it today. In France, the guillotine, that machine for the production of rapid and discreet deaths, represented a new ethic of legal death. But the Revolution had immediately endowed it with a great theatrical ritual. For years it provided a spectacle. It had to be removed by the barrier Saint-Jacques. The open cart was replaced by a closeted carriage. The condemned man was hustled from the vehicle straight to the scaffold. Hasty executions were organized at unexpected times. In the end, the guillotine had to be placed inside prison walls and made inaccessible to the public, by blocking the streets leading to the prison in which the scaffold was hidden, and in which the execution would take place in secret. Witnesses who described the scene would even be prosecuted, thereby ensuring that the execution should cease to be a spectacle and remain a strange secret between the law and those it condemns. One has only to point out so many precautions to realize that capital punishment remains fundamentally, even today, a spectacle that must actually be forbidden. Similarly, the hold on the body did not entirely disappear in the mid-19th century. Punishment had no doubt ceased to be centered on torture as a technique of pain. It assumed as its principal object loss of wealth or rights. But a punishment like forced labor or even imprisonment, mere loss of liberty, has never functioned without a certain additional element of punishment that certainly concerns the body itself. Rationing of food, sexual deprivation, corporal punishment, solitary confinement. Are these the unintentional but inevitable consequence of imprisonment? In fact, in its most explicit practices, the imprisonment has always involved a certain degree of physical pain. The criticism was that of 10 leveled at the penitentiary system in the early 19th century. Imprisonment is not a sufficient punishment. Prisoners are less hungry, less cold, less deprived in general than many poor people or even workers. Suggests a postulate that was never explicitly denied. It is just that a condemned man should suffer physically more than other men. It is difficult to dissociate punishment from additional physical pain. What would a non-corporal punishment be? There remains, therefore, a trace of torture in the modern mechanisms of criminal justice, a trace that has not been entirely overcome, but which is enveloped increasingly by the non-corporal nature of the penal system. Okay. So although it is drawn a contrast immediately, a trace of the torture in the modern mechanisms of criminal justice, which has not been entirely overcome, but which is enveloped by the non-corporal nature of penal systems. I see. It's been enveloped rather than overcome. Interesting. Sarah asks once again, getting the whole art thing from Freud, since it mentions a more hedonistic art, but this is punishment as a spectacle and its effects, I guess. In a sense, I kind of get it. It might be macabre to turn it into show, but it's death. Something grand like clinical and emotional logical method might just be less human. Hold on to that second thought, but your initial thought, yeah, it's of course it is a description of the punishment spectacle of it, and how, you know, that was so widespread, and how when we look back in hindsight, how barbaric we condemn it to be. This torture, right? And while it might be, you know, as it less of a show, the clinical and emotional logical method might be less human, I think that is, hold on to that thought as we go through. I know that Foucault's gonna, you know, go through this. So, good thought. Hold on to that, please. Also, I hope it's not too serious. If some levity helps, feel free to talk and chat and make jokes about BDSM or whatever, as you please. You know, if the levity helps you swallow the content, you're more than welcome to. Whatever helps, whatever works for you. But yeah. Alright, let's go back to it. A reduction in penal severity in the last 200 years is a phenomenon with which legal historians are well acquainted. But for a long time, it has been regarded in an overall way as a quantitative phenomena. Less cruelty, less pain, more kindness, more respect, more humanity. In fact, these changes are accompanied by a displacement in the very object of the punitive operation. Is there a diminution of intensity? Perhaps. There's certainly a change of objective. If the penalty, I'm so sorry, I keep reading it as penalty, but usually it's penalty. If the penalty in its most severe forms no longer addresses itself to the body, on what does it lay hold? The answer of the theoreticians, those who about 1760 opened up a near period that is not yet at an end, is simple, almost obvious. It seems to be contained in the question itself. Since it is no longer the body, it must be the soul. The expiation that once rained down upon the body must be replaced by a punishment that acts in depth of the heart, on the heart, the thoughts, the will, the inclinations. Maply formulated the principle once and for all. Punishment, if I may so put it, should strike the soul rather than the body. Interesting. It was an important moment. The old partners of the spectacle of punishment, the body and the blood, gave way. A new character came on the scene, masked. It was the end of a certain kind of tragedy. Comedy began with shadow play, faceless voices, impalpable entities. The apparatus of punitive justice must now bite into this bodiless reality. Is this any more than a mere theoretical assertion, contradicted by penal practice? Such a conclusion would be over-hasty. It is true that today to punish is not simply a matter of converting a soul, but Mabley's principle has not remained a pious wish. Its effects can be felt throughout modern penality. To begin with, there is a substitution of objects. By this I do not mean that one has suddenly set about punishing other crimes. No doubt the definition of offenses, the hierarchy of the seriousness, the margins of indulgence, what was tolerated in fact and what was legally permitted, all this has considerably changed over the last 200 years. Many crimes have ceased to be so because they were bound up with a certain exercise of religious authority or a particular type of economic activity. Blasphemy has lost its status as a crime. Smuggling and domestic larceny, some of their seriousness. But these displacements are perhaps not the most important fact. The division between the permitted and the forbidden has preserved a certain constancy from one century to another. On the other hand, crime, the object with which penal practice is concerned, has profoundly altered the quality, the nature, in a sense, the substance of which the punishable element is made, rather than its formal definition. Under cover of the relative stability of the law, a mass of subtle and rapid changes has occurred. Certainly the crimes and offenses on which judgment is passed are juridical objects defined by the code. But judgment is also passed on the passions, instincts, anomalies, infirmities, maladjustments, effects of environment or heredity, acts of aggression are punished, so also through them is aggressivity, rape, but at the same time perversions, murders, but also drives and desires. But it will be objected, judgment is not actually being passed on them. If they are referred to at all, it is to explain the actions in question and to determine to what extent the subject the subject's will was involved in the crime. This is no answer, for it is these shadows lurking behind the cage itself that are judged and punished. They are judged indirectly as attenuating circumstances that introduce into the verdict not only circumstantial evidence, but something quite different, which is not judicially codifiable. The knowledge of the criminal, one's estimation of him, what is known about the relations between him, his past and his crime, and what might be expected of him in the future. They are also judged by the interplay of all those notions that have circulated between medical and jurisprudence since the 19th century. Monsters of George's times, Shami's psychical anomalies, the perverts and maladjusted of our own experts, and which, behind the pretext of explaining an action, are ways of defining an individual. They are punished by means of a punishment that has the function of making the offender not only deserious, but also capable of living within the law and of providing for his own needs. They are punished by the internal economy of a penalty, which, while intended to punish the crime, may be altered, shortened, or in certain cases extended, according to changes in the prisoner's behavior. And they are punished by the security measures that accompany the penalty: prohibition of entering certain areas, probation, obligatory medical treatment, and which are intended not to punish the offense but to supervise the individual, to neutralize his dangerous state of mind, to alter his criminal tendencies, and to continue even when this change has been achieved. The criminal's soul is not referred to in the trial merely to explain his crime and as a factor in the judicial apportioning of responsibility. If it is brought before the court with such pomp and circumstance, such concern to understand in such scientific application, it is because it too, as well as the crime itself, is to be judged and to share in the punishment throughout the penal ritual, from the preliminary investigation to the sentence and the final effects of the penalty. A domain has been penetrated by objects that not only duplicate but also dissociate the juridicially defined and coded objects. Psychiatric expertise, but also in a more general way, criminal anthropology and the repetitive discourse of criminology find one of their precise functions here. By solemnly inscribing offenses in the field of objects susceptible of scientific knowledge, they provide the mechanisms of legal punishment with a justifiable hold not only on offenses but on individuals, not only on what they do but also on what they are, will be, may be. The additional factor of the offender's soul, which the legal system has laid hold of, is only apparently explanatory and limitative, and is in fact expansionist. During the 1500 or 200 years that Europe has been setting up its new penal systems, the judges have gradually, by means of a process that goes back very far indeed, taken to judging something other than crimes, namely the soul of the criminal. Penal system always has been about punishing and not recovery, so arisen some essence of suffering, less outward, not a slow show, but a science. By the way, same human. Don't confuse with humane. I wouldn't say always, but there certainly is a shift to emphasize recovery more. That's been, that Foucault kind of writes and documents. Yes. Sorry, only a sick late night, me and my visual on chat for now. Don't worry. If you're sick, you should go to bed. Keeping yourself up when you're sick is punishment. That would not be good. I would not like you to be punished. So, go to sleep if only to feel better. The VOD will be here. Blob is also saying that you have nothing to say. Don't worry. If you have nothing to say, don't feel too pressured to say anything. And don't feel too pressured to, in fact, think too heavily into this stuff as well, because it is heavy stuff. All I can hope for is that you just at least listen to it a little bit so that you can internalize maybe some of the ideas. That's all. And you don't have to do it the first time as well. Don't worry about that. I say this every stream. I think I'll continue saying it every stream. Alright. Let me drink some water. I'm also a bit sleep deprived, so I understand completely. Okay. And by that very fact, they have begun to do something other than pass judgment. Or to be more precise, within the very judicial modality of judgment, other types of assessment have slipped in, profoundly altering its rules of elaboration. Ever since the Middle Ages slowly and painfully built up the great procedure of investigation, to judge was to establish the truth of a crime. It was to determine its author and to apply a legal punishment. Knowledge of the offense, knowledge of the offender, knowledge of the law, these three conditions made it possible to ground a judgment in truth. But now, a quite different question of truth is inscribed in the course of the penal judgment. The question is no longer simply, has the act been established and is it punishable? But also, what is this act? What is this act of violence or this murder? To what level or to what field of reality does it belong? Is it a fantasy, a psychotic reaction, a delusional episode, a perverse action? It is no longer simply who committed it, but how can we assign the causal process that produced it? Where did it originate? In the author himself? Instinct, unconscious, environment, heredity? It is no longer simply what law punishes this offense, but what would be the most appropriate measures to take? How do we see the future development of the offender? What would be the best way of rehabilitating him? A whole set of assessing, diagnostic, prognostic, normative judgments concerning the criminal have been lodged in the framework of penal judgment. Another truth has penetrated the truth that was required by the legal machinery. A truth which, entangled with the first, has turned the assertion of guilt into a strange scientifico-juridical complex. A significant fact is the way in which the question of madness is evolved in penal practice. According to the 1810 Code, madness was dealt with only in terms of Article 64. Now this article states that there is neither crime nor offense if the offender was of unsound mind at the time of the act. The possibility of ascertaining madness was therefore a quite separate matter from the definition of an act as a crime. The gravity of the act was not altered by the fact that its author was insane, nor the punishment reduced as a consequence. The crime itself disappeared. It was impossible, therefore, to declare that someone was both guilty and mad. Once a diagnosis of madness had been accepted, it could not be included in the judgment. It interrupted the procedure and loosened the hold of the law on the author of the act. Not only the examination of the criminal suspected of insanity, but the very effects of this examination had to be external and anterior to the sentence. But very soon, the courts of the 19th century began to misunderstand the meaning of Article 64. Despite several decisions of the Supreme Court of Appeal confirming that insanity could not result either in a light penalty or even in an acquittal, or require that the case be dismissed, the ordinary courts continued to bring the question of insanity to bear on their verdicts. They accepted that one could be both guilty and mad. Less guilty the madder one was, guilty certainly, but someone to be put away and treated rather than punished. Not only a guilty man, but also dangerous since quite obviously sick, etc. From the point of view of the penal code, the result was a mass of juridical absurdities. But this was the starting point of an evolution that jurisprudence and legislation itself was to precipitate in the course of the next 150 years. Already the reform of 1832, introducing attenuating circumstances, made it possible to modify the sentence according to the supposed degrees of an illness or the forms of a semi-insanity. And the practice of calling on psychiatric expertise, which is widespread in this assize courts and sometimes extended to courts of summary jurisdiction, means that the sentence, even if it is always formulated in terms of legal punishment, implies more or less obscurely judgments of normality, attributions of causality, assessments of possible changes, anticipations as to the offender's future. It would be wrong to say that all these operations give a substance to our judgment from the outside. They are directly integrated in the process of forming the sentence. Instead of insanity eliminating the crime according to the original meaning of Article 64, every crime and even every offense now carries within it as a legitimate suspicion, but also as a right that may be claimed, the hypothesis of insanity, in any case of anomaly. And the sentence that condemns or acquits it is not simply a judgment of a guilt, a legal decision that lays down punishment. It bears within it an assessment of normality and a technical prescription for a possible normalization. Today, the judge, magistrate, or juror certainly does more than judge. Sorry, I'm just a little tired. Just wanted to catch my breath. It's been a rough few days. All right. And he is not alone in judging. Sorry, let me do that again. And he is not alone in judging. Throughout the penal procedure and the implementation of the sentence, there swarms a whole series of subsidiary authorities. Small-scale legal systems and parallel judges have multiplied around the principal judgment. Psychiatric or psychological experts, magistrates concerned with the implementation of sentences, educationalists, members of the prison service, all fragment of the legal power to punish. It might be objected that none of them really shares the right to judge. That some, after sentence is passed, has no other right than to implement the punishment laid down by the court. And above all that, others, the experts, intervene before the sentence, not to pass judgment, but to assist the judges in their decision. But as soon as the penalties and the security measures defined by the court are not absolutely determined, from the moment they may be modified along the way, from the moment one leaves to others and the judges of the offense the task of deciding whether the condemned man deserves to be placed in semi-liberty or conditional liberty, whether they may bring his penal tutelage to an end, one is handing over to them mechanisms of legal punishment to be used at their discretion. Subsidiary judges they may be, but they are judges all the same. The whole machinery that has been developing for years around the implementation of sentences and their adjustments to individuals creates a proliferation of the authorities of judicial decision-making psychiatric experts. Judicial decision-making, and extends its powers of decision well beyond the sentence. The psychiatric experts, for their part, may well refrain from judging. Let us examine the three questions to which, since the 1958 ruling, they have to address themselves. Does the convicted person represent a danger to society? Is he susceptible to penal punishment? Is he curable or readjustable? These questions have nothing to do with Article 64, nor with the possible insanity of the convicted person at the moment of the act. They do not concern responsibility, they concern nothing but the administration of the penalty, its necessity, its usefulness, its possible effectiveness. They make it possible to show in an almost transparent vocabulary whether the mental hospital would be a more suitable place of confinement than the prison, whether this confinement should be short or long, whether medical treatment or security measures are called for. What then is the role of the psychiatrist in penal matters? He is not an expert in responsibility, but an advisor on punishment. It is up to him to say whether the subject is dangerous, in what way one should be protected from him, how one should intervene to alter him, whether it would be better to try to force him into submission or to treat him. At the very beginning of his history, psychiatric expertise was called upon to formulate the true propositions as to the part that the liberty of the offender has played in the act yet committed. It is now called upon to suggest a prescription for what might be called his medico-judicial treatment. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. I'll be back in a moment. Hi, sorry about that. Just wanted to wash my face because I'm a little drippy. I'm kind of falling over a bit. These streams are beginning to work on me. But yeah, truth be told, just a little tired, that's all. Morning, librarian. Morning. In the sense, judges of the judgmental states, yeah. We should make judges just people who make weird faces when you do anything. There's social judgment involved in there. A much weaker version of what Foucault is getting at. Hey chat, hello RPG Casual, welcome. You should have a snack and show me. No, I'm okay. But I promise the stream I'm going to carry it through. We'll stop at the end of this section. Should be in, I think 10 more pages. I'm not sure, but yeah. To sum up, ever since the new penal system, that defined by the great codes of the 18th and 19th centuries, has been in operation, a general process has led judges to judge something other than crimes. They have been led in their sentences to do something other than to judge. And the power of judging has been transferred in part to other authorities than the judges of the offense. The whole penal operation has taken on extrajudicial elements and personnel. It will be said that there is nothing extraordinary in this, that it is part of the destiny of the law to absorb little by little elements that are alien to it. But what is odd about modern criminal justice is that although it has taken on so many extrajudicial elements, it has done so not in order to be able to define them judicially and gradually to integrate them into the actual power to punish. On the contrary, it has done so in order to make them function within the penal operation as non-judicial elements, in order to stop this operation being simply a legal punishment, in order to exculpate, in order to exculpate the judge from being purely and simply he who punishes. Of course, we pass sentence, but the sentence is not in direct relation to the crime. It is quite clear that for us it functions as a way of treating a criminal. We punish, but this is a way of saying that we wish to obtain a cure. Today, criminal justice functions and justifies itself only by this perpetual reference to do something other than itself, by this unceasing reinscription in non-judicial systems. Its fate is to be redefined by knowledge. Beneath the increasing leniency of punishment, then, one may map a displacement of its point of application. And through this displacement, a whole field of recent objects, a whole new system of truth, and a mass of roles hitherto unknown in the exercise of criminal justice. A corpus of knowledge, techniques, scientific discourses is formed and becomes entangled with the practice of the power to punish. This book is intended as a correlative history of the modern soul and of a new power to judge, a genealogy of the present scientifico-legal complex from which the power to punish derives its basis, justifications and rules from which it extends its effects and by which it masks its exorbitant singularity. But from what point can such a history of the modern soul on trial be written? If one confined oneself to the evolution of a legislation or of penal procedures, one would run the risk of allowing a change in the collective sensibility, an increase in humanization, or the development of the human sciences to emerge as a massive, external, inert, and primary fact. By studying only the general social forms, as Durkheim did, one runs the risk of positing as the principle of greater leniency in punishment processes of individualization that are rather one of the effects of the new tactics of power, among which are to be included the new penal mechanisms. This study obeys 4 general rules. 1. Do not concentrate the study of the punitive mechanisms on their repressive effects alone, on their punishment aspects alone, but situate them in a whole series of their possible positive effects, even if these seem marginal at first. As a consequence, regard punishment as a complex social function. 2. Analyze punitive methods not simply as consequences of legislation or as indicators of social structures, but as techniques possessing their own specificity in the more general field of other ways of exercising power. Regard punishment as a political tactic. 3. Instead of treating the history of penal law and the history of the human sciences as 2 separate series whose overlapping appears to have had one or the other, or perhaps on both, a disturbing or useful effect according to one's point of view, see whether there is not some common matrix, or whether they do not both derive from a single process of epistemological juridical formation. In short, make the technology of power the very principle both of the humanization of the penal system and of the knowledge of man. 4. Try to discover whether this entry of the soul onto the scene of penal justice, and whether the insertion in legal practice of a whole corpus of scientific knowledge is not the effect of a transformation of the way in which the body itself is invested by power relations. In short, try to study the metamorphosis of punitive methods on the basis of a political technology of the body, in which might be read a common history of power relations and object relations. Thus, by an analysis of penal leniency as a technique of power, one might understand both how man, the soul of the normal or abnormal individual, have come to duplicate crime as objects of penal intervention, and in what way a specific mode of subjection was able to give birth to man as an object of knowledge for a discourse with a scientific status. But I'm not claiming to be the first to have worked in this direction. Rushen Kirchheimer's great work, Punishment and Social Structures, provides a number of essential reference points. We must first rid ourselves of the illusion that penalty is above all, if not exclusively, a means of reducing crime, and that in this role, according to the social forms, the political systems or beliefs, it may be severe or lenient, tend towards expiation of obtaining redress, towards the pursuit of individuals or the attribution of collective responsibility. We must analyze rather the concrete systems of punishment. Study them as social phenomena that cannot be accounted for by the judicial structures of society alone, nor by its fundamental ethical choices. We must situate them in their field of operation. In which the punishment of crime is not the sole element. We must show that punitive measures are not simply negative mechanisms that make it possible to repress, to prevent, to exclude, to eliminate, but that they are linked to a whole series of positive and useful effects, which it is their task to support. And in this sense, although legal punishment is carried out in order to punish offenses, one might say that the definition of offenses and their prosecution are carried out in turn in order to maintain the punitive mechanisms and their functions. From this point of view, Rusch and Kirchheimer relate the different systems of punishment with the systems of production within which they operate. Thus, in a slave economy, punitive mechanisms serve to provide an additional labor force, and to constitute a body of civil slaves in addition to those provided by war or trading with feudalism at a time when money and production were still in an early stage of development. We find a sudden increase in corporal punishments, the body being in most cases the only property accessible to penitentiary. Forced labor and the prison factory appear with the development of the mercantile economy. While the industrial system requires a free market in labor, and in the 19th century the role of forced labor in the mechanisms of punishment diminishes accordingly and corrective detention takes its place. There are no doubt a number of observations to be made about such a strict correlation, but we can surely accept the general proposition that in our societies the systems of punishment are to be situated in a certain political economy of the body. Even if they do not make use of violent or bloody punishment, even when they use lenient methods involving confinement or correction, which is always the body that is at issue, the body and its forces, their utility and their docility, their distribution and their submission. It is certainly legitimate to write a history of punishment against the background of moral ideas or legal structures, but can one write such a history against the background of a history of bodies when such systems of punishment claim to have only the secret souls of criminals as their objective? Historians long ago began to write the history of the body. They have studied the body in the field of historical demography or pathology. They have considered it as the seat of needs and appetites, as the locus of physiological processes and metabolisms, as a target for the attacks of germs or viruses. They have shown to what extent historical processes were involved in what might seem to be the purely biological basis of existence, and what place should be given in the history of society to biological events such as the circulation of bacilli or the extension of the lifespan. But the body is also directly involved in a political field. Power relations have an immediate hold upon it. They invest it, mark it, train it, torture it, force it to carry out tasks, to perform ceremonies, to emit signs. This political investment of the body is bound up in accordance with complex reciprocal relations with its economic use. It is largely as a force of production that the body is invested with relations of power and domination. And on the other hand, its constitution as a labor power is possible only if it is caught up in a system of subjection, in which need is also a political instrument, meticulously prepared, calculated, and used. The body becomes a useful force only if it is both a productive body and a subjected body. This subjection is not only obtained by the instruments of violence or ideology, it can also be direct, physical, pitting force against force, bearing on material elements, and yet without involving violence. It may be calculated, organized, technically thought out. It may be subtle, make use of neither of weapons nor of terror, and yet remain of physical order. That is to say, there may be a knowledge of the body that is not exactly the science of its functioning, and a mastery of its forces that is more than the ability to conquer them. This knowledge and its mastery constitute what might be called the political technology of the body. Of course, this technology is diffuse, rarely formulated in continuous systematic discourse. It is often made up of bits and pieces. It implements a disparate set of tools or methods. In spite of the coherence of its result, it's generally no more than a multiform instrumentation. Moreover, it cannot be localized in a particular type of institution or state apparatus, for they have recourse to it. They use, select, or impose certain of its methods. But in its mechanisms and its effects, it is situated at a quite different level. What the apparatuses and institutions operate is, in a sense, a microphysics of power, whose field of validity is situated in a sense between these great functionings and the bodies themselves with their materiality and their forces. Now, the study of this microphysics presupposes that the power exercised in the body is conceived not as a property but as a strategy, that its effects of domination are attributed not to appropriation but to dispositions, maneuvers, tactics, techniques, functionings, that one should decipher in it a network of relations constantly in tension, in activity, rather than a privilege that one might possess, that one should take as its model a perpetual battle rather than a contract regulating a transaction or the conquest of a territory. In short, this power is exercised rather than possessed. It is not the privilege acquired or preserved of the dominant class, but the overall effect of its strategic positions, an effect that is manifested and sometimes extended by the position of those who are dominated. This is a good point he stresses out a bit, that initially I didn't really think much about the difference of. He stresses it's not a thing you have, not a privilege, it's not a thing, it's something you exercise, so it's interesting. Furthermore, this power is not exercised simply as an obligation or a prohibition on those who do not have it. It invests them, is transmitted by them and through them. It exerts pressure upon them just as they themselves, in their struggle against it, resist the grip it has on them. This means that these relations go right down in the depths of society, that they are not localized in the relations between the state and its citizens, or on the frontier between classes, and that they do not merely reproduce at the level of individuals, bodies, gestures, and behaviors the general form of the law or government, that, although there is continuity, they are indeed articulated on this form through a whole series of complex mechanisms. There is neither analogy nor homology, but a specificity of mechanism and modality. Lastly, they are not univocal. They define innumerable points of confrontation, focuses on instability, each of which has its own risks of conflict, of struggles, and of an at least temporary inversion of the power relations. The overthrow of these micropowers does not then obey the law of all or nothing. It is not acquired by once and for all by a new control of the apparatuses, nor by a new functioning or destruction of the institutions. On the other hand, none of its localized episodes may be inscribed in history except by the effects that it induces on the entire network in which it is caught up. Perhaps, too, we should abandon a whole tradition that allows us to imagine that knowledge can exist only where the power relations are suspended, and that knowledge can develop only outside its injunctions. Sorry, I was muted. How long was I muted for? wasn't muted for very long, right? Okay. I was just... Okay. Okay, it's fine. Yeah. Okay, right? Okay. Man, I wish I was more awake or healthy. Tara, please just get some sleep, man. It'd be better to digest on with more sleep, you know? When I like only about 10 seconds. Okay, thank you. Thank you for reassuring me. If it helps, I sometimes, or rather back in the olden days, 50 something odd years ago, when I took exams, when I did examinations, or rather when I prepared for them, I would always get a good night of sleep. That was like always worth it. Much more than anything I could ever cram. And that was what helped the most. Because without sleep and water, you just get debuffed, and it's really hard to pay attention to class or even do anything. Even just and genuinely any form of function is so much more difficult if you're tired and or dehydrated. So keep in mind those things. Punishment is a discipline studying the aspects of philosophy, sociology, and politics of it to see a soul. I think it's more than that. It's not just soul. The soul idea is just a part of it. It's just kind of a way to see what that category, like a way to examine that categorization people made back then. If I recall correctly, early Foucault was vaguely a Maoist. He abandoned the framework pretty quickly, though. I don't know if this is before or after. Not sure if that has much bearing on what is written here, but it's an interesting tidbit to perhaps look into further. Okay. Keep going. Perhaps, too, we should abandon a whole tradition that allows us to imagine that knowledge can exist only where the power relations are suspended, and that knowledge can develop only outside its injunctions, its demands, and its interests. Perhaps we should abandon the belief that power makes mad, and that by the same token, the renunciation of power is one of the conditions of knowledge. We should admit rather that power produces knowledge, and not simply by encouraging it because it serves power or by applying it because it is useful, that power and knowledge directly imply one another. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. These power-knowledge relations are to be analyzed, therefore, not on the basis of a subject of knowledge who is or is not free in relation to the power system, but on the contrary, the subject who knows the objects to be known, and the modalities of knowledge must be regarded as so many effects of these fundamental implications of power knowledge and their historical transformations. In short, it is not the activity of the subject of knowledge that produces the corpus of knowledge, useful or resistant to power, but power knowledge that produces and struggles that traverse it, and of which it is made up, that determines the forms and possible domains of knowledge. To analyze the political investment of the body and the microphysics of power presupposes, therefore, that one abandons, where power is concerned, the violence ideology opposition, the metaphor of property, the model of the contract or of conquest. That, where knowledge is concerned, one abandons the opposition between what is interested and what is disinterested, the model of knowledge and the primacy of the subject. Borrowing a word from Petty and his contemporaries, but giving it a different meaning from the one current in the 17th century, one might imagine a political anatomy. This would not be the study of a state in terms of a body, with its elements, its resources, and its forces, nor would it be the study of a body and its surroundings in terms of a small state. One would be concerned with a body politic, as a set of material elements and techniques that serve as weapons, relays, communication routes, and support for the power and knowledge of relations that invest human bodies and subjugate them by turning them into objects of knowledge. It is a question of situating the techniques of punishment, whether they seize the body in the ritual of public torture and execution, or whether they are addressed to the soul. In the history of these body politic, of course, of considering penal practices less as a consequence of legal theories than as a chapter of political anatomy. Kantorowicz gives a remarkable analysis of the king's body, a double body according to the juridical theology of the Middle Ages, since it involves not only the transitory element that is born and dies, but another that remains unchanged by time and is maintained as the physical yet intangible support of the kingdom. Around this duality, which was originally close to the Christological model, are organized by an iconography, a political theory of monarchy, legal mechanisms that distinguish between as well as link the person of the king and the demands of the crown, and a whole ritual that reaches its height in the coronation, the funeral, and the ceremonies of submission. At the opposite pole, one might imagine placing the body of the condemned man. He too has his legal status, he gives rise to his own ceremonial, and he calls forth a whole theoretical discourse, not in order to ground the surplus power possessed by the person of the sovereign, but in order to code the lack of power with which those subjected to punishment are marked. In the darkest region of the political field, the condemned man represents the symmetrical, the inverted figure of the king. We should analyze what might be called in homage to Kantorowicz the least body of the condemned man. If the surplus power possessed by the king gives rise to the duplication of his body, has not the surplus power exercised on the subjected body of the condemned man given rise to another type of duplication? That of a non-corporal, a soul, as Mobley called it. The history of this microphysics of the punitive power would then be a genealogy, or an element in a genealogy of the modern soul. Rather than seeing the soul as the reactivated remnants of an ideology, one would see it as the present correlative of a certain technology of power over the body. It would be wrong to say that the soul is an illusion or an ideological effect. On the contrary, it exists. It has a reality. It is produced permanently within the body by the functioning of a power that is exercised on those punished, and in a more general way on those one supervisors trains and corrects over madmen, children at home and at school, the colonized over those who are stuck at a machine and supervised for the rest of their lives. This is the historical reality of the soul, which, unlike the soul represented by Christian theology, is not born in sin and subject to punishment, but is born rather out of methods of punishment, supervision, and constraint. This real non-corporal soul is not a substance. It is the element in which there are articulated the effects of a certain type of power, and the references and the reference of a certain type of knowledge, the machinery by which the power relations give rise to a possible corpus of knowledge, and knowledge extends and reinforces the effects of this power. On this reality reference, various concepts have been constructed and domains of analysis carved out: psyche, subjectivity, personality, consciousness, etc. On it have been built scientific claims and scientific techniques and discourses, the moral claims of humanism. But let there be no misunderstanding. It is not that a real man, the object of knowledge, philosophical reflection, or technical intervention has been substituted for the soul, the illusion of the theologians. The man described for us, who we are briefly invited to free, is already in himself the effect of a subjection much more profound than himself. A soul inhabits him and brings him to existence, which is itself a factor in the mastery that power exercises over the body. The soul is an effect and the instrument of a political anatomy. The soul is the prison of the body. That punishment in general and the prison in particular belong to a political technology of the body is a lesson that I have learned not so much from history as from the present. In recent years, prisons revolt have occurred more throughout the world. There was certainly something paradoxical about their aims, their slogans, and the way they took place. They were revolts against an entire physical misery that is over a century old, against cold, suffocation, and overcrowding, against decrepit walls, hunger, physical maltreatment. But they were also revolts against model prisons, tranquilizers, isolation, the medical or educational services. Were they revolts whose aims were merely material? On contradictory revolts against the obsolete, but also against comfort, against the wardens, but also against the psychiatrists. In fact, all these movements and the innumerable discourses that the prison has given rise to since the early 19th century have been about the body and material things. What has sustained these discourses, these memories, and invectives, are indeed those minute material details. One may, if one is so disposed, see them as no more than blind demands or suspect the existence behind them of alien strategies. In fact, they were revolts at the level of the body against the very body of the prison. what was that issue was not whether the prison environment was too harsh or too aseptic, too primitive or too efficient, but its very materiality as an instrument and vector of power. It is the whole technology of power over the body, that's the technology of the soul, that of the educationalists, psychologists, and psychiatrists fail either to conceal or to compensate for the simple reason that it is for one of the tools. I would like to write the history of this prison, with all the political investments of the body that it gathers together in its enclosed architecture. Why? Simply because I am interested in the past? No. If one means by that writing a history of the past in terms of the present, yes. If one means writing the history of the present. And that is part 1, section 1, the body of the condemned. There's section 2 of this, the spectacle of the scaffold, that goes into a bit of it a little later. But I'm really sorry. But I'm a little tuckered out today. I kind of overestimated my energy before the stream, and I kind of just really felt like I wanted to do a stream anyways, so I'm sorry, but this stream is going to be a little short today. I guess that makes it easier to consume as a VOD, I suppose, right, if I keep it short. But because the next chapter, or rather the next part, spectacle of the scaffold, seems to be a little long, as I see to be. Right, so the body of the condemned was about 30 pages. This one's about 40 pages. And I don't think I can make another 40 pages. I'm sorry. I think it would have been ideal. It would have been good for the stream if I could. I think it would have been good length, but today we'll stop here. I think we can pick this up next time, or in fact, maybe over the weekend, if I can, try to schedule one again. Turbulences. After Papers, Please, we can read more of this. I think it would work out if we sandwich the Papers, Please in the Foucault reading. Maybe that would work. Whichever everyone here prefers, or rather, whichever I can get around to doing, I suppose, because it can be your preference, but it's ultimately my decision. Yes. History of punishment changes the punishing the body to try to manipulate the soul, way of being someone. Which method is now alienated labor or something? Maybe. You're getting at something. You're getting at a little bit more now, I think. I can't say what though, because I'm not getting it either. Okay. Oh no, sorry, I already responded to that, but no, yeah. My sourdough starter exploded what I lost. I hope that's fine. You didn't miss out on much, Udara, but we read part 1, section 1 today. And my apologies, but I'm a little tired beyond that. Do I have any first impressions of the text? Not quite, except for I think he's going for, it seems less like some of the other philosophical texts we've read, which is very like, here's the ideas, bam, 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 you know, and here's why society is, here's why the public is stupid, and here are my clever opinions on life, right? And this is more like a diagnosis / deconstruction and an in-depth look and critique into the history of it. Which is an interesting change of pace. Not to say there's any less philosophy in this at all. That's not what I'm saying, but you know what I mean. That's my impression of it so far. I haven't read enough to form an opinion on the content of it yet, because it just seems like it's still setting up, obviously, because it's just part 1. But yeah, that's about it. Coffee paradoxes. That's fine. There's more of the reading than I had in the past months. Well, that's good. And if you stick around, there's going to be more readings that happen, and you don't have to feel too pressured to attend all of them. You don't have to feel too pressured to even be attentive to the ones you do attend, but just know that a little bit of reading is nice. Coffee stream got pretty sleepy in no time. That's good. That's, you know, if it helps you sleep, then why not, right? It's certainly helping me sleep. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me this rather short and strangely scheduled and timed stream. My apologies for that, but thanks for joining everyone, and we will have Papers, Please on Friday. I'll try to make it Friday, but I'm not sure if Friday will work exactly because turbulences, but Nonetheless, there will be Papers, Please. And then there will be more of Foucault. At least until we finish part 1, right? All right. Can we watch the VOD with more attention? It's a problem with the cell phone. Sure, take your time with it. The wonderful thing with the preservation of these things is that they last forever, or effectively forever. They last as much time as you'll be alive, probably. I don't think YouTube will go down before we do, be honest. But yes, thank you everyone. Thanks for the company. Thank you all for the company, really. And I will see you soon. Goodbye. God, this is the first time I've gotten sleepy from my own sleepy streams. Although I was sleepy before it, but you know. It's finally worked on myself. How brilliant, how brilliant.